Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the ringer. The ringer is kind of a genetic anomaly in ball pythons. Essentially what it is, it's usually right along the tail area of the snake where you have a little bit of white coming up the side. Sometimes it goes all the way around the tail of the ball python in a ring, thus the name ringer. And it's kind of interesting. As a matter of fact, most ringers are produced from some of the genetics in the snake. Sometimes the genes, you have a certain mix of genes, or you have certain genes in the snake that have a tendency to form ringers on the ball python, and sometimes it is completely unexpected. And today I kind of want to jump over the internet and I want to show you what a ringer looks like, and I want to show you some of the genes that are responsible for possible ringers. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on morphmarket.com and I want to show you this snake. This snake has an obvious ringer. If you take a look at it, it looks like just a normal, classic, wild type ball python, all the way until you get right before the end of the tail and you have this little kind of a band of really bright white right around the tail. That is called a ringer. And the interesting thing is over here on Morph Market, you can actually list your snake as a ringer. You can actually put it in here, and normally you have different colors for different genes. Like pink would be recessive, blue is a codominant, and in this case it's kind of grayed out because technically it's not really a gene. It's not really, it's not really recessive or codominant or dominant or anything like that. As a matter of fact, when you produce a ringer, I'd say it's a really small probability that you'll actually produce another ringer. So for example, if you actually bred this to something else, you might get a small amount of ringers, maybe 10%, maybe even less than that. I say it's more or less kind of a random anomaly. And if you actually take a look at the genetics behind the snake, this one's actually 100% het pied, and I would say most of the ringers are actually from being het pied. And it's kind of weird because het pied is considered a recessive mutation, although there are a few pied markers that you can actually see. They're not really reliable. You don't see them in all cases. Sometimes you'll see tracks right down the belly, kind of like on either side of the belly, really dark lines, like someone took a marker or a Sharpie or something and drew lines all the way down, usually right before the vent, lines on either side of the snake on the belly. That is a pied marker. Another pied marker, which is pretty obvious, is this little ringer right along the tail here. And sometimes you can see really big ones like this. This is probably one of the best examples of a ringer that I've seen in any snake. So I kind of want to just jump through and show you some of the ringers on some of these snakes and some of the genetics behind the ringers. So take a look at this one. This one's actually a super black pastel fire het pied. This one's 100% het pied, and you can definitely tell this is probably from the het pied. As a matter of fact, the super black pastel tends to have ringers by itself, and then you throw in the het pied, and sometimes it's really obvious. You can definitely see the ringer on this one. If you actually look at the genetics, this is actually a super black pastel, 2 copies of the black pastel gene. It also has fire in there. And most of the times when people are actually working with the super black pastel, they're shooting for the panda pied, which is a really jet black snake with the white coming in. It's like it's probably almost like an ink jet black kind of a color of a snake with the pied markings coming through. As a matter of fact, if you look at the price on this one, this was $1,650. Everyone that's shooting for the panda pieds are, once you get to this point, it's really expensive once you get close to it. As a matter of fact, I pulled up another one here. This is what the super black pastel het pied looks like. This is like the beginning of a panda pied. You breed 2 of these together and you get the panda pied, which has a lot more white coming in here. And you can see this one isn't a visual pied. It just has 1 copy of the pied gene, but it has the ringer coming in a little bit right along the tail. So here's another one. This is actually a leopard banana het pied ringer. If you actually look at the genetics on this one, they actually listed ringer as one of the, it's not really a gene, it's one of the characteristics, one of the visual characteristics of this particular snake. And sometimes people will actually put ringers in here where the snake will have a ringer right along the tail, and they won't actually list it here on Morph Market. I actually found some of these searching for ringers. I found some of them based on what I thought the genetics would be, that would actually produce a visual ringer. And this, keep in mind, this isn't like a low expression pied. In most cases, if you actually had 2 copies of the pied gene and it was a really low white pied, sometimes you'll actually see this, in a low white pied, like an Enchi pied or something like this, where it'll just have a little bit of white. Usually we don't call that a ringer. Usually a ringer is kind of just a random genetic anomaly. So here's another one. This is a Black Widow ringer. If you actually look at the genes in the snake, there's a lot of genes going on. This is actually the spider pastel, black pastel, and it has the ringer, and it's 66% het pied. And it's, you actually look at some of the genetics, and I'd say probably the black pastel is almost, it has just as much influence as het pied for a ringer. If this didn't actually have the black pastel in there, and it actually had the ringer in it was 66% het pied, I would think, yeah, this is probably 100% het pied based on the ringer. But I've actually seen quite a few black pastels that have ringers, so sometimes it can kind of trick you. It's not always the case that it is het pied. It's kind of the same with the het pied markers, like the belly tracks. If you have any kind of het pied markers, I'd say there's probably a 90% chance that it's het pied, but there still could be het pied markers where it's not actually het pied. So here's another one. This is actually a female Cinnabee leopard, 66% het pied. If you look at the genetics, it's leopard, cinnamon, spider, 66% het pied, and it actually has the little ringer right on the tail. And the interesting thing is sometimes the cinnamon will also produce ringers. So I'd say if it didn't have the cinnamon, it didn't have the black pastel, and it was 66% het pied, maybe I would say it's probably het pied, but you can't really tell because of the cinnamon influence. Here's another one. This is kind of interesting. This is actually a champagne, and I would say in addition to het pied, champagnes always seem to have a really high probability of ringers somewhere on the snake, and sometimes you can actually see multiple ringers on champagne. You can see a little bit here, almost another one here, and another one here. And this one's actually, they're actually calling this a paradox, because usually with paradox it actually has unusual colors that aren't expected, usually like some black spots on the snake that aren't really expected. This one's actually just a cinnamon and a champagne, no het pied at all, and it still has the ringers on it. I'm thinking it's probably because of the influence of the cinnamon mixed with the champagne. High probability of ringers in that combo. Here's another one, Mojave Champagne Ringer, and this is not het pied either. This is actually a combination between the Mojave and the Champagne. I would say Champagne with a lot of combos, you'll actually see these little ringers. This one's kind of interesting. It has a little black outline, almost pied looking. It's kind of interesting how the Champagne works with a lot of combos. And I kind of wanted to run you just through a few of these Champagnes. This is actually a Champagne Cinnamon Ringer, girl. So it's kind of interesting, the Champagne and the cinnamon. You can definitely see a high influence. This one almost looks like a visual pied, which is pretty amazing for the Champagne. Here's another one, the Pastel or Pewter Champagne Yellow Belly Paradox Ringer Het Clown. That is a mouthful. If you actually look at all the genes in here, and you can definitely tell there's ringers in here. You can barely see it in the yellow color of the snake, kind of peeking out here and there through the snake. And I would say, looking at this, it's probably from the influence of the Champagne and the cinnamon that is probably bringing out most of the ringers in this snake here. Here's another one. This is actually just a Champagne, no other genes in the mix, and it still has a ringer. That just kind of shows you, you don't even have to have any other genes in with Champagne. Sometimes you get a random ringer, and sometimes the ringers don't go all the way across and around the snake. Sometimes it's just a little bit coming up. Sometimes you can barely almost see the ringers, and people will still call it a ringer. So here's another one that's kind of a high-end snake here. This is actually an Orange Dream Enchi Champagne Yellow Belly. Look at how beautiful that is. Probably one of the best Champagne combos I've seen, with a really big ringer right on the tail. And even if it covers the entire tail, we still call it a ringer, even though it's more or less than, you know, your typical ring. Lots of genes in here. And the interesting thing is, I've also found a lot of times with ringers, you'll also see the Orange Dream produce a lot of ringers. So I'd say it's mainly combinations with champagne that tend to produce ringers, especially if you have Orange Dream, Black Pastel, or Cinnamon in the mix, and Het Pied also produces a ringer in a lot of cases. So I just kind of wanted to show you this one kind of as an example. This is actually a Champagne Yellow Belly, 100% Het Pied, and it's kind of interesting if you actually mix the champagne with one copied of the pied gene, you actually get a snake that looks like a visual pied, and in this case you really wouldn't call this a ringer because there is just too much white on this particular snake, and it's kind of a unique anomaly with the champagne. If you actually take a champagne Het Pied and you breed it to another pied, you can actually produce a champagne visual pied with two copies of the pied gene, and in that case you get a completely white snake with no color at all. Kind of a weird, unique anomaly with the champagne, and it's kind of interesting. Some people actually mistakenly think, you know, they're breeding champagne Het Pieds together, and they kind of mistakenly think this is actually a champagne pied, and they don't realize the influence of one copy of the pied gene with the champagne produces what looks like a visual pied. So here's another one that I thought was kind of interesting. This is actually, if we actually look at the genes on this one, this has so many genes. This actually has a Yellow Belly, Black Pastel, Calico, Black Pastel, and Chocolate, and it has a ringer. So it's kind of interesting. This one doesn't have any champagne, doesn't have the Het Pied, but if you actually look at some of the genes in here, I'm thinking just the Black Pastel is probably the gene that is affecting this to kind of bring out the ringer. And you can see, in this case, it doesn't have, you know, the full ringer all the way across the snake, but we still call it a ringer. Here's another one, the Paradox Black Pastel Calico Yellow Belly Pastel Ringer, also known as the Oreo Blizzard. And just take a look at all these genes in here. Here again you have the Black Pastel. That is probably what probably has the most effect bringing out a ringer on this snake. So here's another one. This is a Super Pastel Leopard Ringer Het Clown, and this is an example where you actually don't have any of the genes that I would think that would produce a ringer. So you have Super Pastel, Leopard, Het Clown. None of those genes have a really high tendency to produce ringers, but you actually see really strong ringers. Sometimes it can just be a weird genetic anomaly. You know, so I'd say there's usually a low probability, even with all the right genes, that you'll actually hit a ringer. And sometimes you won't have any of the right genes and you'll still produce ringers, which is kind of interesting. So here's another one. This is the Pastel Super Stripe, and I kind of wanted to show you this example where someone actually considers this a ringer, but it has a really light kind of a ringer down here. You almost can't even tell that this is a ringer. As a matter of fact, I was looking at a lot of snakes over on Morph Market, and they're like, is that really a ringer? And you can definitely tell the black line coming right down the side kind of breaks right by the ring here. Really faint ringer. Sometimes they can be incredibly faint where you can hardly see him at all. So here's the last one I wanted to show you. This is actually the Hot Chocolate Oreo Blizzard. Some of these names are pretty wild. This is actually, look at all the genes in here. The black, the calico, the fire, the yellow belly, the chocolate, and the lesser. And it's kind of interesting on this one, you don't really have the genes that have a high tendency to produce the ringer, even though you can kind of see it. And I'd say it's a really slight ringer right along the tail here. Almost can't even see it, but this is definitely considered a ringer. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And Helena asks, where did the ball python morph names come from? I feel like it's the wild, wild west of name picking. And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, if you have a brand new ball python morph, you can pretty much name it whatever you want to name it. And you have to be really careful if you think you have something new. I'd say number one, you want to make sure that nobody else has actually produced that before. I've seen a lot of these where people start naming these new genes coming to the market and they produce something in their collection, they think it's brand new, and they assign a name to to it. Come to find out, it's already been produced and it already has another name that's kind of in the market already. So that's probably one of the biggest things you have to watch out for. And another thing is, if you actually produce something really unusual, you want to make sure that it's actually genetic. So a lot of times people produce something unusual and then they'll start breeding it to figure out if it's co-dominant or if it's dominant or recessive. And sometimes you'll actually produce a weird looking, kind of unusual, like a dinker snake, and a lot of times it won't actually be genetic. You'll try to breed it to a bunch of stuff and you'll never reproduce the parent. But if you actually do find something and it's really neat and exciting and everybody's really into it, you pretty much get to name it whatever you want to name it. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.